All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right, presentation update on sea level rise assessment.
Okay, Chair and Commissioner, so the next item on your agenda is a continuation of a dialogue that we started when John Moore from Noble Consultants was last here, and at that time we were talking about improvements in Basin 3, and one of the things that I asked John to do as part of that presentation was give you the first blush of some of the work he's doing on sea level rise assessment, and at that point we were looking at some of the inundation maps for different points in time and for different places within the harbor. What you have tonight is an update on some of the work that John has been doing to further evaluate sea level rise in the harbor and the impacts that it may have on some of the existing resources that are there today. We're really undertaking this work under a requirement from the state. It's AB 691 is a law that was passed that requires grantees of public land who earn more than $250,000 in revenue from those lands to prepare a sea level rise assessment to understand the effects that sea level rise may have on those trust assets. So it's really a state lands commission requirement, if you will, that we prepare this report and evaluate that impact on the harbor itself. So John's done some additional work. I want him to come up tonight and talk a little bit about the work he's done to look at. We'll quickly show you the 2100 inundation maps. You've seen those previously, but then take you through some of the work that we've been doing to look at the impacts on the property, the economic impact that it could have on the city as a result of some inundation that may occur, and then to start to talk about some of the strategies that we might be thinking about. We're not bound by these strategies. Really, this is a report that we're preparing to the state to let them know what we think the impacts could be and some possible strategies, but in no way are we binding the city to implement those strategies. And in fact, as you know, time evolves and things we learn more, those strategies may evolve and change over time. So this is really, you'll see a kind of a short-term idea and a long-term possibility in terms of what strategies we may be able to be implemented. Our intent is to give you this presentation this evening, kind of take you through some of the next pieces of work that John's been working on. Any comments or feedback that you may have for us that we could take back, and then we will be preparing an actual written report that will be submitted to the state. Our intent is to bring that to you at your July meeting. We're running a smidge behind schedule. We're supposed to have that to the state by July 1st, but I told them that we'd have it in around July 15th, and they told me no problem. So we wanted to walk you through this piece tonight before we finished off the written component, and we'll bring that to you for your consideration in July. So with that, I'd like to ask John Moore, who you all know, he's been here before talking about this matter, to walk us through some of the additional work that's been going on as part of our preparation for AB 691 compliance. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Good evening, Madam Chair and Commissioners. As usual, Stephen does a great job with the introduction. Hopefully I don't have to say too much. But what you'll find is this is not just me. This, as we get into it, you'll see that it's a little bit of a team effort going on here. So, just to summarize for you tonight, the study purpose and objective, as Stephen alluded to in this sea level rise study, is to assess what the inundation hazards are going to be or projected for King Harbor. What might be some strategies that we can begin to discuss and introduce to begin to deal with the problem, because that's always the hardest part. And then, as Stephen mentioned, to comply with the AB 691 requirements. The next slide just summarizes for you what AB 691 requires. It was passed in 2013 by the Assembly and requires that all trustees of tidelands submit a report to the State Lands Commission that summarizes what the impact of sea level rise is on the granted tidelands, map the areas that will be affected, specifically in the years 2030, 2050, and 2100, to kind of make it easy to come up with those three milestone benchmarks. estimate the financial cost that may impart, and then begin to describe how the trustee might begin to deal with, to protect and preserve the assets and the resources. So you're more familiar with this than I am. This is basically the summary of the harbor, the general harbor land use of the harbor, but I just wanted to point out the location of the mean high tide line, which is the demarcation between tidelands and uplands. And a good bit of the improvements that we are looking at are actually on city property and out of the tidelands area. The next slide kind of summarizes a little bit where we are today. This is a 20-year plot of the monthly maximums from the Santa Monica tide gauge. So this is meant just to give you a quick visual on what has happened and what will likely happen into the future, just in terms of the normal astronomical tide, particularly the king tides and the ones that give us fits, or you give the harbor fits, and realizing that the seawalls in basins 1, 2, and 3, or anywhere in the neighborhood of elevation 7 and a little bit higher, that's the kind of the issue that we're already dealing with today on occasion. When you look into the future, on the next slide, this is the projection that we talked about last time when we were looking at this in March, and this is the summary that lists every projection that anybody's made to date on what sea level rise might be between now and the next century. And obviously we're dealing with a very wide range in prediction. It makes it difficult, therefore, how do you plan for that, because there's so many differences. The state has offered up what they wish everybody to do, and on the last slide, just to show you the red, yellow, and green curves, which on the next slide now are summarized in tabular form. These are the tabular summary of what the state has listed as what we should consider, what everybody should consider. And it's kind of a confusing nomenclature of probability definition in this low risk aversion and medium high risk aversion and extreme risk aversion, and what does all that mean? It's basically different scenarios of models that are looking at greenhouse gas emissions over time, how that might impact the global ice sheets and the warming of the ocean and the expansion of seawater, and how that might translate to a future elevation. And there's a wide variation. The left column is closest to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the worldwide body that's a global expert on the issue, and then the right two columns are where the state's coming from. The right being a very extreme scenario. If we were looking at something that's a very high priority, a nuclear power plant or whatever, perhaps of that nature. So when you're actually looking into the planning, what value should we use? The next slide kind of points to this medium high risk aversion column is kind of being consistent with what Coastal Commission picked first in 2013. Or 2015, I should say. They updated it in 2018, last year. And so this is what I would call a reasonable value to begin looking at planning from a planning framework for King Harbor, and that's the values that we were using in this initial look-see. So the next slides, you might remember we went through these last time. This is the 2100 inundation maps, which just kind of illustrate taking those numbers from the last slide for the 2100 sea level rise, what it might translate into in terms of inundation, static inundation depth in the various parts of the harbor. This being the North Harbor. Next slide is the north, what I'm just calling for convenience, the North Central Harbor, or the North Central portion. The next slide, South Central, and then lastly the South End. And the bottom line is that the good bit of the harbor is impacted by 2100, and that's the nature of the beast. And then on top of that is the wave hazard component. Now, I don't expect you to read all these numbers, but what we just want to do tonight is just give you a feel for that. Added on top of the sea level rise will be different levels of transmitted wave heights that come through and into the harbor and through the breakwater, depending on the return period of the storm, and it'll affect Moldy more and lesser as you go up to the north, and then we all are familiar with the overtopping component up in Mole. So this just says that we need to also be mindful of that along these shoreline frontages as we get into the next aspect of it, which is what do you do about it? This is the most challenging aspect of the whole task. It's relatively easy to summarize and document. Here's what we think is going to happen, even though there's going to be a wide range and predictability of what might happen. But in terms of what do you do about it, you can probably simplify it in terms of these three strategies. There's not a whole lot of options. You can either obviously elevate, so we raise everything out of harm's way. You can protect in place, so we basically build a barrier in front of the infrastructure and improvements of import to protect it from the rising water, or we can retreat. We can you pull up stakes and go inland, which, as we know in King Harbor, is kind of hard to do because the purpose of the harbor, of course, is to optimize and promote public access to the water, and we don't have a whole lot of room to move inland to recreate the same opportunities. So tonight we just wanted to briefly give you just some extreme ends of the envelope as to what might be done to deal with the future. The first would be what we would call a short-term fix, and that might be your 2030, 2050 time horizon, where we're dealing with kind of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, and it involves basically raising the elevation of, let's say, the perimeter seawalls in basins 1, 2, and 3 to deal with that recurring problem around the perimeter of the walkway. We want to maintain the existing revetment on Mole B. We want to maintain the splash wall, obviously, on Mole C and D. Maybe build a new splash wall as required on the Horseshoe Beach area to protect the parking garage. And item number 5, I think, is pretty important. That's a kind of something that probably needs to be initiated soon because the federal process takes so long to complete, and that's basically raising the federal breakwaters in anticipation of what's going to come down the road, because the breakwaters are going to be an important part of the future protection for the harbor, obviously. So the sooner that, as Stephen would say, that conversation starts with the feds, you can begin to get ahead of the game. From a long-term standpoint, this is kind of an extreme scenario of how to deal with it, and it's basically not a whole lot of rocket science here. It's basically raising everything out and above the static level of, elevation 13 with some freeboard allowance and some allowance for some waves on top of that where it needs to be accommodated. And so you're raising elevation landslide. You're thinking about building new seawalls within the perimeters of the marina basins, new splash walls on the outside shoreline of the outer harbor. Number 4 is the optimistic goal to complete that federal project by that time, so that new breakwater is in place, because the way to think of that is if sea level rise by 2100 is going to be 6 feet higher thereabouts than today, that's equivalent roughly to what the breakwater height was in 1988 when the harbor was damaged by the 1988 storms. So that's why that's kind of an important item. And then, taking care of any splash wall needs at the south end of the harbor.
Can I ask a question before we move?
Certainly.
So what's your reference for the, how much you have to raise it? Is that off of normal sea level, or is we have to raise the moles by 15 feet from what they are today?
No, I'm sorry. That's the elevation. So that's the elevation that...
Above sea level?
That's elevation relative to a datum, which is NAVD 88 or mean lower low water. So think of the sea level with an extreme king tide is going to be about plus 13. So if you allow, let's say, for a minimum, a minimum of 2 foot of freeboard, say you want to be at least about plus 15, and then maybe on the south end of the harbor there may be maybe a little bit more allowance to accommodate, maybe some wave.
So what's the current level today? Just about, I don't need exact.
It varies. Like up in Mole A, it's around 10. Mole B, it's anywhere from 9 to 11. C and D, it's around 10, 10 and a half. D is around 10 to 11. And in and around Basin 3, the international boardwalk area, that's around 8. And the first floor of the parking garage, maybe around, roughly around elevation 10, something like that. So we're looking at, that, either a barrier, to barricade that extra, sea level rise, or we just lift everything up, which is the most expensive, obviously,
Okay,
option.
thanks.
And the next slide kind of gives just a kind of a sketch to show this extreme fix solution where you might construct a new sheet pile breakwater around the whole perimeter of each marina basin, which would then allow you to raise the grade and preserve as much territory as you can within the existing moles. And on the right, the different blue lines kind of help you, or blue colors, you kind of help you visualize where zero mean lower low water is now, where roughly where your king tide is now, and roughly where that'll all be as projected in 2100.
Wow.
So that's the 6 foot increase. If that's the right number, some people think it's less, some people think it's more. But that's kind of the generally accepted number at the moment, particularly the one that the state kind of lets us all use. Now, if we go kind of hybrid and in the middle of the two, what we just talked about, the next slide just kind of summarizes. There's a lot of options that can be considered rather than doing a full raising of the land elevation. You can make, if you will, bathtubs where you're basically diking and berming around the perimeter of these moles to barricade, kind of the Holland or the Netherlands approach, and then being mindful of how we deal with stormwater runoff and that when we're making these, fortified depressed areas within the harbor. You can do low height walls on grade, so you're kind of raising, a low height wall close to the seawall to kind of affect the same thing and buy time. And I suppose you could consider, selective managed retreat, although I hate to throw that out there, but we need to talk about everything, I suppose. But that would be, say, some areas of, mole B for purposes of discussion. And so it can be kind of a mix and match, and that's kind of where we're at now, is we're kind of taking all these basic options and we're trying to meld them into a common sense approach as to how to best deal with this, or let's say suggest some things that can be debated and discussed into the future, because you have time. So for as we mentioned in it, the AB 691 requirements, they want to know what's the economics involved with this. And this slide is courtesy of the hard work of Lori Koike from Waterfront Economic Development, to kind of give you an idea of what is the impact from a revenue standpoint if nothing is done by 2100. And it's kind of separated into the tidelands areas and the uplands areas, and you get it's kind of a feel that we're dealing with some pretty significant, numbers of, loss of income, not only for the tenants, but the city and also the economy at large. Another way to look at it is courtesy of Geraldine from Public Works Engineering, is what are the impacts to the public infrastructure. This is by no means a complete list. It doesn't include everything, but actually I jumped myself. But this is Geraldine's slide,
Yeah.
and this is the infrastructure slide, which shows a substantial amount of money just for the known public infrastructure that will have to be dealt with, either replaced, improved, or repaired. And then the previous slide is a feel for kind of what's the loss potential to buildings, to building improvements and structures throughout the harbor. And this is based on a rough depth damage curve analysis that the Corps of Engineers has kind of perfected, and they used Hurricane Sandy to improve that analysis a little bit. And what it says is, based upon the depth of water at a building, that they translate that to a percentage of loss of a structure, and assuming that that's a valid order of magnitude number for the moment, this kind of gives you another feel for the, that we're talking about some significant, numbers in terms of what's going to be the expectation of 2100 if all this is not, dealt with. So, remaining tasks, as Stephen mentioned, is we need to refine these response strategies. We need to complete the draft report and solicit and get your review and comment. And then we need to ultimately submit this to the state. As Stephen mentioned, it's non-binding. I'm just speculating on my part, but I think the state is asking all the grantees to submit these reports so they can accumulate this database in terms of the problem and the order of magnitude dollars, so that perhaps optimistically, they'll approach the legislature and maybe provide, at least I would hope, provide the local agencies with some tools and more importantly, some money to begin to deal with this. So did I miss anything, sir?
No, I think that's, John's kind of covered it. All the diagrams that you've seen in John's presentation are things that will be incorporated into the report. We wanted to give you a flavor of the kinds of topics and issues that are raised. None of it's easy. There's a lot of estimating and kind of trying to calculate economic impact and structural damage to buildings and infrastructure is not an exact science. So I think to John's point, it's helpful for them to understand order of magnitude in the event that you get to 2100 and you have the types of inundation scenarios that John is portraying. He's almost outlined the report for you in verbal format without a written format, but to give you a sense of what's going to be in each of the sections. I will say, John and I have spent a lot of time talking about the long-term strategy and trying to think through how the city would approach that long-term strategy, knowing that an option where you're looking to just do fill and try to raise yourself out of the floodplain is challenging in a built environment that we have in the harbor today. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about where do those opportunities exist, or are we more likely going to find ourselves in kind of that diking type scenario where we're really doing perimeter treatments, but to the extent where we have built footprints and built environment, what we're doing is looking to protect those rather than elevate them. And depending on which road you go down for that final strategy would impact significantly the cost associated with whatever that implementation strategy would be. And that is one of the components that we're, sort of the last component that we're wrestling with. So when we talked about tonight's presentation and started to think about how we would frame this up in the report, I think John framed it up correctly, which is we tried to give you the bookends. Here's a short-term strategy to address something that's happening, and here's a long-term strategy that's probably the most aggressive of the long-term strategies, which would be get yourself out of that area, raise that developed footprint out of the inundation zone, when in the reality is it's probably going to be a combination of things. We just don't have the ability to go out and scrape the harbor clean and start all over again anywhere from 5 to 7 feet higher up than where we are today. Where we have development opportunities, we might be able to do that. I know when we did the Shade Hotel, we were cognizant of some of those issues in terms of setting some of the floor elevations for the Shade property, but we just don't have that opportunity across the harbor. So that's probably the one thing we've been kicking around the most to try to think through how do we represent this in the report. So any thoughts you have, we're open to those ideas because we're still struggling a little bit with how we want to present that data to the state. So with that, I'm happy to turn it to you. John is here and available to answer any questions you might have. Our office, as he mentioned, and our Public Works, great help from Public Works, kind of compiled some of the data to help him generate those order of magnitude. So to the extent you have questions about those, we can help answer those as well. So with that, I turn it back to you, Chair Callahan.
First of all, before I turn it over to the commissioners for questions, I'd like to thank you for the great presentation, even for lay people like myself who are not engineers and don't have an engineering background. I understand. So thank you very much. And Lori, that was a lovely number crunch. Starting with Commissioner Carlson.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So you showed us a short-term plan and a long-term plan. Last time you were here, you showed us damage, infrastructure wear and tear in Basin 3. What's the status of that work? Does that fall into the short-term plan or just even shorter-term maintenance?
Yeah, actually, when we get to our budget item, one of the things that you recommended and that we took to the capital improvement programming process is making repairs to the Basin 3 seawall, which includes some of the structural work that John brought up, some additional follow-on work for cathodic protection studies, but also included a moderate cap on that wall. So that's really the beginning of some of our short-term strategies in that basin. Obviously, that's not a long-term solution, but it might help us, in some of the flooding that we're experiencing currently and some of the king tides that occur in that area. So we have that as a proposal for the council as part of their budget to do improvements in Basin 3, which includes really 4 items. The cathodic follow-on cathodic protection study, the improvements to the gangway landings for the marina, which I think John documented pretty well last time, are in dire need of some work. The cap, the repair and adding the cap to the top of the seawall, and then also really not a big item, but a minor item in terms of removing some of the piles and the support structures for the hoist that's been removed that are still staying in the water there. So we have that as part of the capital improvement program as one project. We're calling that one project. And then separate and apart from that, we have added a capital improvement line item for the replacement of all the docks inside of Basin 3, the actual dock systems themselves, which are in dire need of replacement. So those are recommendations as part of the current budget, the current CIP. If council adopts that, then those would be work items going forward, and we'd be able to add those to our queue of capital improvement items. So I think I would characterize those, the long answer to your question, as our short-term strategies. We haven't begun any of the work really on the long-term strategies.
Okay. The study you did of Basin 3, I mean, we've talked about this before. I really wish you would look at Basin 1 and 2 as well.
Yeah.
Basin 3 is about 2,000 feet. The other two basins probably have, 8,000 feet. I understand the walls aren't as high, but there could be big problems there. There's only a couple of gangways in Basin 3. There are dozens throughout the other basins. So how did you fund the study done in Basin 3? Was that something we have budget for, or is that something that should be in the capital improvement process as well?
It kind of came about. It kind of came about as a result of the negotiations we were actually having for the waterfront project itself. Okay. Within the waterfront project, the city was going to be responsible for certain capital improvements that would be implemented, one of which was the infrastructure work in Basin 3. So what we added to the capital improvement plan, it might have been a year or two ago, was to add some money into that plan to start to do some of that initial assessment work. And because had that plan been moving forward, we would have had that responsibility. And frankly, we're the property owner there even today, so we have that responsibility either way. So that's really how that got selected as the first piece of the puzzle in terms of doing the assessment of that area. No more magic to it really than that. I think the next piece would be to say, could we fund some additional money to start to do those same levels of assessments for the other basins?
Yeah, I just would really like to know if it's a don't worry about it, or an oh my God, because I can find you as much rebar and seeping concrete as you would ever like in the other basins. Second and final question: when we go to dredge the harbor, can that fill during this dredging or in a future dredging be used to augment the moles? You got a lot of sand, real handy.
That's about 60,000 cubic yards. So it's really just a little small minor amount in terms of what you'll ultimately need way down the road. So unfortunately, no.
Okay.
But maybe one little, if you could dedicate one little spot, that actually save you a lot of money, actually.
And then, from then on, just everybody who comes down to their boat, bring a bucket of dirt.
That's your entry.
Thanks a lot.
Commissioner Light.
Yeah, so while we're talking to the Corps of Engineers about the breakwater, can we broach the topic of, raising it?
We have. It's a complicated question from their perspective, and in part because the conversations around the breakwater, whenever we talk about the repair work, so they've done their initial assessment and they've sort of said, there's some work that needs to be done on the breakwater. We own the bottom 2/3, and when it was raised, the city owns the top third. And so we start to get into conversations of whose responsibility is it to do what work. So, and that's just for the repair work. When we've brought the issue up of sea level rise on top of that, it hasn't been well received in terms of doing the repair work to the breakwater. It almost is seen as another project that would have to occur, and maybe it's a down the line type project. They haven't been very open to the idea of trying to meld those two into one big project that would be both a repair and raising the level of the breakwater for a sea level rise accommodation. So we haven't gained a lot of traction there. Frankly, we've been kind of focused on getting the repair work done and trying to push as much of that repair cost to their side of the plate. So on days when they're trying to be helpful, they'll say, well, gee, you know, the top wouldn't have failed if the bottom hadn't failed, and the bottom's ours, and so really it's our responsibility to do it all. That's on the days when they're trying to be helpful. On the days when they're not trying to be so helpful, well, that's your responsibility on the top. We only have the bottom third. So we haven't really been even able to iron that piece out, and to be perfectly frank, we haven't gained any traction on could we do a betterment project to try to make it taller, stronger, to withstand
having worked
that.
in the federal government for my professional career,
Yeah.
getting in their pipeline of projects now
Yes.
means you may have success later. And then the other side is trying to get some of the elected officials to start lobbying our congressmen to set aside some money.
That is our next step, quite frankly. I mean, I think both for just the project at hand, we would like to start to see some additional pressure because it's moving too slowly for our tastes. Not only for the repair work of the break wall itself, but we had been hoping to partner with them on some of the dredging activity in the harbor where they would need to do material removal to gain access to do repair work, and we would piggyback on that contract to do some of the dredging to provide access in the harbor itself. We're now starting to feel like maybe we just need to go on our own so that we can keep that project advancing forward, and if they ultimately marry up, that's great, but we're not trying to hold up now necessarily the dredging activity in the harbor because we realize how urgent that's becoming.
Yeah, I've found federal agencies to be much more cooperative when you're lobbying for money for them.
Understood
So
and
if you
agreed.
can do both at the same time, you're more likely to get success.
Yeah.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, the study or the process that we were talking about and kind of envisioning it's a planning study. So it's basically, if you go that route, it's what happened back in '88. It was a storm damage reduction study, and so there's a whole Corps of Engineers planning process where you do an initial look at the problem and see if there's a national economic interest in the fix, and in this case there is, because there was in '88. And you can almost argue that you could take your '88 report and translate it to 2100 because that's about the same equivalent situation. So they're a Byzantine organization, but I love to work with them, but but you're right. I mean, if you get the Corps loves it when you lobby on their behalf because they can't lobby on their own, and they work for Congress, and if Congress tells them to do it, by God, they'll do it.
Yeah.
So
I had a couple questions on your briefing. You had a graph of the recent king tides. Can you put that back up? So if you look at that, it would look almost like it was, and I know it's a 20-year period, so it's pretty short, but it would look like it started to rise and then it leveled off.
yeah, well, see, if you look at the tide gauge data, the Santa Monica gauge, I think, is only increased about an inch. And if you go to the next slide, see, we're right there on the flat part of the curve. So everybody is kind of banking that in the next 20, 30 years, we're going to
Ramp up.
right. And that's the big question. Is that going to, because you'll see there's those bottom set of data points are those people that are predicting with low emissions and this and that
You'll circumvent.
that's going to be the rate. And there's others that are calling for Armageddon on the other, on the other end of it. So just based upon tide gauge data, I think it's like I said, it's been about an inch over the last, whatever. And so one would say, hey, there's no problem. But this is what everybody is is kind of saying, and I guess we'll know, and we'll actually know in 20, 30 years, and that's kind of where you're going to plan, or kind of kick off your plan, because then you're either going to wipe your brow and say, hey, it's not so bad, or it's, oh my God, we got to do something.
Yeah. Can you go to the slide that showed the cutaway elevation of the long term?
With the sheet pile wall, with the,
Kind of showed the, the
cross-section?
The cross-section, yeah.
this one?
Yeah. So, I mean, when we were talking Center Cal, you're talking a 99-year lease, so you're out at past 2100. If we had levied this kind of growth or mitigation on them, it would be a steep climb down to the docks for quite a while, and I'm sure there's ADA ramp angle compliance that would have made the ramps very complex under that. So it seems like, we'd almost have to plan in a phased approach to this, but that's hard when you get to how much do you raise the moles?
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly right. That's what makes this so difficult. When do you pull the trigger? And that's why this, the buzzword is adaptive management plan. So people do these adaptive management plans where they kind of propose what they're going to do now, and they're going to declare what they might do, or supposedly what they will do in the future if things get worse. Because clearly, as you say, if you build for 2100 now, it's kind of ridiculous. So that's why it's so, and so probably the way to look at it is, think of it that's why we put up that short-term plan, where maybe you just propose to, or you just look out to 2030, 2050, and you deal with that, and then when you're at 2050, you're going to have a real good idea of what's happening from there on out, and that will probably be when you want to take the next step, if in fact you have to.
So the problem is, you want to get projects going now, and what do you mandate on them? And it just seems like shorter term, maybe half-life of the Center Cal or the 60-year is the logical thing to do, because you're going to have to reassess as you go. You don't want to go all out now, or you drive costs way up, and you don't want to give them a 99-year lease, and they're stuck with.
Yeah, this is a very difficult question, and frankly, the other piece of the puzzle that we don't have guidance on is what are the regulatory agencies going to impose on us as part of that? We never really got to that part of the dialogue for any of the waterfront revitalization work that we've been doing. We've never really sat down and said, okay, how are we going to implement the short-term strategy? How are we going to do the adaptive reuse strategy, and then be able to implement the long-term strategy down the road? And I think beyond the question you raise is there's even a more philosophical question within the agencies where armoring and protecting is not their favorite strategy. They would much prefer to see agencies doing managed retreat. And we just don't have, the nature of what we're working with, I think John said it as part of his presentation, we don't have the ability to do that. We weren't constructed in a way, we're not going to get back to a natural state through some kind of a managed retreat program. We need to find a way to preserve the assets that we have. And so we never quite were able to we had just started some of those conversations about how is this going to work from a long-term perspective on permitting? What obligations would the commission place on a developer who's working in the waterfront to have that long-term responsibility? How is that going to be implemented over time? And great questions, and we just never really got to get to the meat of how we were going to tackle those kinds of things. Who was going to ultimately have that long-term responsibility? And, the ability to do adaptive management also means you're preserving some areas that you can adaptively manage into.
Right.
Again, in a more natural setting, that may be a little easier to do. In a built environment, not so easy. So, we're really at the beginnings of these conversations of trying to figure out what's going to be acceptable, who's going to bear the brunt of what responsibilities. Beyond Center Cal, we have master leaseholders that are going to be coming in on a regular basis looking for renewals. We're going to have to answer those questions as part of those renewal processes because we'll be asked those questions. If you're, it may not be a 100-year lease, but it might be a 66-year lease. Well, that's going to put us close to 2,100 or, darn near it.
Yep.
So how are we tackling those kinds of questions? So I think those are the issues we'll have to wrestle with as we start to have some of these longer term agreements come up and open for discussion. And
So I think-
unfortunately, we don't have a great set of answers yet.
Yeah. I think we should mandate that they build either on piles that you can just jack it up over time, or you build it on floats. And
Yeah,
No, it's a tough problem.
floats may be the better one. I don't know. We'll see.
that's all I had, Vicki.
My question is, will the reports that are being submitted by all the trustees be shared amongst them so that they can all glean maybe something?
They will. My understanding is as the reports come in, and I think John articulated it pretty well, we're not entirely sure what the objective here is, and it's not clearly articulated in the legislation in terms of what the final objective of having these reports being prepared is, but we suspect that it's to try to generate an order of magnitude. I think there are some agencies that have submitted a couple of reports and they're starting to show up online, and everybody has different situations. Ours may be more complex than a very small jurisdiction that only has to protect a very small area. When you start to look at all the different trustees up and down the state, and as a matter of fact, not all of them are obligated to produce a report. If you don't generate more than $250,000 in revenue for a particular year, you're not obligated to produce a report. If the cost to produce the report is more than you earn in a year, you're not obligated to produce a report. So curiously, there are some exemptions to even doing the report. So we're not entirely sure how these things will get stitched together and how they'll get used by the state, but we suspect it's hopefully to try to understand the order of magnitude of the issue and then start to think through strategies, assistance, hopefully, how we work through the various challenges that all these grantees face going forward. I mean, you can imagine a grantee like the city and county of San Francisco, for example, where, under extreme sea level rise conditions, your feet are getting wet part of the way up Market Street. How are they going to address these kinds of issues? So there are, some real challenges that lie ahead.
Okay?
Good thing we're not Hermosa.
Yeah. Has any commissioner have anything else? Any public comment? Don't sit down, Mark.
As long as I'm on my way. Mark Hansen, King Harbor Boater. I was in the bathroom and had a good idea. Two kind of high-level related thoughts on this is, as the director said, the federal agencies, their favorite is retreat. And I've read a lot of stuff on that, and they're pretty serious about that as far as their preference. John Noble mentioned that retreating wasn't a great option for us because we live in a built-out area, but I'd offer a counterpoint that we're about ready to look at what's going to be done with 50 acres of AES property. So I'd say, there's a big area that you could potentially retreat to. When we were looking at our last waterfront revitalization plans, we were hearing about raising 5 feet. Now it sounds like it might be 6 or 7 feet. I always had trouble envisioning how this was really going to work out. Am I going to be driving down Harbor Drive, looking up 6 or 7 feet to where everything's been built up? Didn't seem very, very practical. So just as a high-level thought, maybe we should be looking, and I know a lot of people have mentioned that the AES and the waterfront revitalization should be coordinated. We were told at one time they were too far off in timing. I'd say that's not an issue anymore. But, should we be looking at what's appropriate on the two areas instead of building a lot of new businesses on top of 7 feet of dirt in the harbor? Maybe some of that new development should be over on the AES property. And then if you think about it, parking lots, open public park space, dry boat storage, they get a lot less damage from a high tide than it coming into the frickin' floors of a bunch of businesses. So yeah, that all those grant money we're hoping to get for park space, as our way of swapping it, let's have some of the open park space and parking, dry boat storage along the waterfront, and then over AS property, we don't have a problem. We can build whatever we have height over there. In fact, you want the height because you get you some great views. So just a couple high-level thoughts. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Anyone else? Public comment? All right. All right, we're at that point. Is there a motion?
Motion to receive and file.
Second.
Is there any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Thank you, John, very much, and staff. All right, we're on to discussion and possible action